Do you feel like you're in prison right about now? You know, the first week of this quarantine, I was doing okay. But then my type A goal-oriented self started to get real antsy. Well, one morning I was having a quiet time reading through Paul's epistles, and I found them to be so productive, so constructive, so loving toward people. And I realized he wrote them from prison. He wrote them while he was in captivity or in quarantine. And I just want to share with you a few transferable principles that I hope will encourage you like they encouraged me. The first one we see is that Paul remained positive. Now, he knew that there was a reason he was in prison, and he trusted God for this. You got to remember, Paul was the one who wrote Romans 8:28 that said, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose." Now, Paul wasn't just during his imprisonment time, he wasn't just laying on the couch, drinking a Dr. Pepper, binge watching CSI, and goofing off in his PJs. Not that I know anybody like that. I'm just saying. Paul was in a dark, damp, and dank prison. He was in a bad spot. But his positive attitude was because of his positive perspective. It says in Philippians 1, and this is Paul saying, everything that has happened to me has helped to spread the gospel. There's a key there. Paul wasn't a victim. He didn't feel like a victim. He didn't act like a victim. So I got a question for you today. Do you believe that God is using your current imprisonment or quarantine for good? Do you believe he can use it for good? That is so important. Paul's circumstances were irrelevant to him. He was going to be used by God, not in spite of being cooped up, but because he was cooped up. And you may feel like, gee whiz, Frank, I've had so many plans for 2020. They're already shot. The rest of the year, I don't know how it looks. But I want to encourage you to stay positive and join God in his plans for you. Secondly, Paul remained productive. You see, Paul was a spiritual life coach. This is what he did. He encouraged people. He helped people. He cheered them on spiritually. He taught them scriptures. He taught them doctrine. And he did that not from the confines of a church or in a church building. Paul didn't need a church building. He did it from prison. And he used written letters to communicate with others and stay in relationship with others. You see, this was before Al Gore invented the internet. So Paul used letters to disciple people. Being in prison never stopped him from working. And maybe there's a way that you can encourage people spiritually, whether it's sharing a Bible verse or discussing doctrine or getting on FaceTime and praying with somebody, talking about the things of God. Or if you know what, at the very least, which is maybe the very best, let someone know that God loves them. Thirdly, Paul stayed prayerful. I want you to listen to what Oswald Chambers said. Prayer does not equip us for greater works. Prayer is the greater work. You know, we forget that prayer is a ministry in and of itself. But if you read Colossians, if you read Ephesians, Paul prayed so powerfully and beautifully for people, and you can do the same thing too while you're quote unquote cooped up. If you don't know what to pray for, I've heard people say that. Well, gee, I don't know what to pray when I talk to God. You know what? Scroll your Facebook page, and there are tons of people who have tons of needs. So stay prayerful. And then Paul stayed an example to those around him. Listen, Paul's response to his imprisonment was a tremendous testimony, both to believers and non-believers. You see, Paul didn't whine and complain and, oh, poor me. Again, he wasn't the victim at all. As a matter of fact, listen to what Acts 16 says about Paul. After a day of being brutally whipped and flogged, it says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Think about that. After a day of misery, Paul is saying, you know what? I'm going to be a testimony. I'm going to be an example. And you know what? Then people looked at Paul and said, there's a guy I could trust. There's a guy who's a genuine Christian. There's a guy who's living out his faith. And right now, during this miserable time in the world, your neighbors are watching you who drive to church every Sunday. We're watching you to see how you respond, how you are going to be a testimony of God's grace, of God's love, of God's strength in your life. So one thing you and I have to do is we have to fine-tune our focus from our circumstances to focusing on the Lord Jehovah God. What he wants to accomplish through us is the greatest thing. Ask him. If you don't know, say, Lord, what do you want to accomplish through me? I also want to challenge you this week. Read the little book of Philippians. Maybe take a chapter a day, but I really want you to read it, to study it. I think it's going to be a great help to you, both spiritually and mentally. God loves you. I love you. Read Philippians and watch what happens. God bless you.